I'm Vandita. You must be wondering where Chetan is and why he isn't here. I believe he is still here somewhere. You may not be able to see him or talk to him today because he's on his way back from Satkur and stuck in a bad traffic jam, thanks to the summer weather and lots of people traveling to the hills. I am Vandita. I am also the co-founder of Himalayan Writing Retreat, but I guess most of you have probably never or rarely ever seen me or heard from me. So you'll have to pardon any mistakes that I make, and I'll try to do my best in not messing up your session. I know this is your guys' session, but I'm so happy to be talking to Aanchal today. I was telling Aanchal earlier, I'm her, I think, definitely one of her biggest fans. I'm sure there must be other big fans too. I loved her book, and we'll be talking about a lot of about that book today and her writing process and writing journey. Aanchal's debut book is titled Remnants of Separation, A History of the Partition Through Material Memory. And it was published by HarperCollins India in 2017. The project under the same name initially began as her MFA dissertation at Concordia University, Montreal, and includes field research in India, Pakistan, and England. It is an attempt to revisit the partition through personal and intimate objects that refugees carried with them across the border during their migration. The Book of Everlasting Things is a novel by Aanchal Malhotra, which was published on December 27th, 2022 by Flatiron Books in the US. In India, it was published by HarperCollins. It has won much praise, including the NPR Book of the Year Award. And welcome, Aanchal.
Thank you so much.
It's really a privilege to be able to talk to you today. And like I said, I mean, I'm really a big fan. I have read the nonfiction book, which is Remnants of Separation. I haven't yet read the nonfiction book. I just wanted to give it a bit of a break before I picked up the second one, as you might understand. But I absolutely loved the first book. So to kind of start the conversation today, I think it's a very, very important book to write, and I haven't, really heard many people talk about the partition. There is, of course, some stuff in terms of films and stuff, but there isn't too much. And considering it was such a big part of our history and personal background for a lot of people, there isn't much conversation around it. So, the first question really is, so what got you thinking about it? What got you to write this book? How did you get into it?
Well, I think primarily for the reason that you said, that when I was growing up, there wasn't so much conversation around the event, despite the fact that all four of my grandparents had witnessed it. Right. And moreover, it was not something that I asked questions about. So when it was taught to us in school, my first instinct was not to come home and ask about it. That may be because of the manner in which history was taught to us in a very removed, distant kind of way, as an event that cannot impact us anymore. But I think the more, let's just say, at home conversations began only when I started asking, which tells you that moments of trauma require some sort of intervention, because it is very difficult to create an entire vocabulary of that trauma if it has never been done before. So I was intrigued by the subject that was also my personal history, of course, our national history. It is a history that we share with our neighbors. And I don't think that it is a history that will ever be exhausted per se. There will always be something new to study about partition, because any event, when seen through the prism of memory, will give us infinite lenses to view it, I think. Hence the exploration in nonfiction and fiction.
Cool. Awesome. Right. So, as I was reading your book, there are a couple of things that stood out for me. So ask me quickly before I forget. These are, this is how you start one of the chapters, right? And these are your grandmother's lines. And then later in the certificates of Sunil Chandra Sanyal, we get to know that Sunil Chandra Sanyal has lost most of his memory, probably to age-related dementia. And now it's his wife who's trying to narrate on his behalf, what happened, whatever she knows about what he remembers. So, I mean, this is incredibly difficult, right? Because we have very, very few people now left from that generation who would have experienced, who have firsthand experience or memories of this. And now, because most of them are aging, to find those people, to be able to talk to people who will be willing to talk and then remember enough to be able to talk about those things, I can imagine it would be extremely, extremely difficult. So how did you do this? How did you go about really finding people and talking to them for this book?
I wish I could say that it was an organized method, but actually it was one person would always lead you to another person, which meant that you were always building organic relationships with people as you were going along. It also was never a transactional conversation per se. It was not that I wanted something from this person. I knew that this person was also getting something in return from me. And it was really, I always use the word conversation rather than interview, because an interview is a very formal, almost stoic style way of looking at things. But I think I started this work in 2013, and even then I thought I was already too late, because, it was almost, well, it was the last generation that had seen the partition firsthand. They were already in their 80s, 90s, some were even older. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we have about this generation is that they would not remember. But in fact, something like partition is very difficult to forget. Sometimes it is harder to forget than to remember it because of the nature of what you would have seen during that time. And this is, of course, something that I learned over time doing my research. When I started, I was 23, certainly not old enough to, not even old enough to empathize. I would say I had to learn so many things. I didn't come from the background of being a historian or an archivist or an oral historian. I was training to be a printmaker. My background was in engraving. And so there was a lot of different learning curves that one had to overcome while doing this fieldwork. Most of all, I had to learn how to find people. So I started with my family, and then I would ask them, can you tell me someone who you know? And then they would tell me someone that they know, and they would tell me someone that they know. And I employed the same method wherever I went, whatever city I went. In Pakistan, I was lucky to be granted a short-term research fellowship with the Citizens Archive of Pakistan that helped me or connected me to people, because I literally knew nobody there when I went. And that was very helpful. But as the project gained some momentum, a lot of younger people started writing to me. Can you come speak to my grandparents? Can you come speak to my parents? We have these objects. Would you like to see them? And I think I never expected multiple generations to be interested. Already I was surprised that, my interest, I was so moved by partition, and I never expected other people of my generation, younger, older, to be interested in it. And I think the more interviews I did, the larger the sort of, I always call it like a family. I keep very good relations with everyone that I've interviewed in India, Pakistan, in Canada, America, UK. And I always see it as a family that I cultivated while doing these interviews. But the beginning of your question is very interesting. You contrast two interviews. My grandmother, who said, ask me quickly before I forget, which is interesting because when we began our conversation, she was quite reticent to actually start sharing. And then I think at some point she realized that if she didn't tell me, then it would end with her. The story would never be recorded. And this is a legitimate fear that some people, not all, feel, that the times that they have lived, the things that they have seen will not be passed down. And I think it takes some time to realize that. On the other hand is the interview with Mr. Sanyal, who suffered a brain hemorrhage. So he had memory loss that he couldn't help. But I think what is important in both instances is to understand who becomes the bearer of people's memories, who receives the story and who passes the story along. In Mr. Sanyal's case, it is his wife. She very naturally takes on that role of keeping not just the family history alive, but also her husband's very unique personal history of having migrated and the things that he saw alive, so she can pass it on. And it's almost like, finishing someone's sentence in a way. That's how it felt, that he would start something and then he would say, oh, don't remember. And she would say, well, it's like this. Remember, you told me, I wrote it down as well. And it felt like an extension of an act of love. You fill in for people that cannot any longer. You finish, you keep. You are the keeper. So I think a lot about who in the family keeps a story and what is the purpose for keeping it and how you pass it along and why you pass it along.
Yeah, that's actually beautifully said, in terms of keeper of memory. I mean, that.
Oh, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Thanks for pointing that out. No, I said that was a beautiful phrase that you used, right? In terms of being a keeper of memory, and I think yeah, at some point it's also in terms of responsibility. I think keeping memories is a big responsibility, and we all need to keep memory.
But I don't think, this is not something you can impose on someone.
Sure.
To decide to keep memory, to decide to walk down that path is something that we all figure out at some point in our lives, and it's a very intrinsic kind of effort. There are descendant generations I've spoken to that have never been interested in histories of their families.
Sure.
Through our conversations, things emerge in their mind that require them to look into the past in a way that they may not have wanted to before or needed to.
Yeah. True. So, and moving on to the next thing, though, I mean, so with these interviews and, with all the data that you were collecting, right, there's a lot of information, and with each conversation that you had, there would be a lot that would have come up, I'm guessing, right? And, just in terms of the book writing process, since there is so much data that's collected, so many conversations and details and everything, right? What process did you follow? Did you first conduct all your interviews or conversations? Did you first have all those conversations and then you started writing, or did you, as you were having these conversations, did you start making notes or start writing then? Or I mean, how did you organize all of this? How did you? What was the process that you followed for that?
Great question. Firstly, I want to say that when you work on anything that relies on field research, the extent of your text will also be reliant on the details you collect. So your primary information is the conversation you've had with the person. And in my case, it's very rare that I move things around in the conversation. So I would usually structure my piece of writing as per the conversation that has happened, because in my opinion, that is just the flow is most natural that way. I conducted interviews. I transcribed those interviews. I translated them to English if they needed to be. I did secondary research, and then I started writing. But because each interview, in my case, was going to be a chapter, research for another interview could happen at the same time as writing another interview. Usually, I would give some time between the recording of the interview and the transcription of the interview. And the reason for this is it's just too heavy. I mean, I think this is the easiest way to say this. It's too heavy. You need some time away. You need to feel like you're not embroidering yourself into that story. You need some time to think about what you have heard. Because when you're in the interview, your primary concern is to allow the person to talk as much or as little as they want to, and to encourage them when they need encouragement, to ask the questions that may help you unearth more information. But you're not always focusing on, how to say this? Imagine that you're going to a foreign country and you're sitting in an archive and you can take photos of as many things as you want because you don't have that much time. And you take all the photos and you come back and you study the archive. You study the photos, you study what you've seen, and you absorb what you have seen. It was very similar. So when I was transcribing the interview was really when I was thinking about the things that they have said, the manner in which they've said it, the voice they have used, where they have paused, where they have taken a breath, where they have laughed or cried. And you are very, there's a great deal of intimacy in that first listening, where it's just you and the voice. And I think for me, it's the voices I can't forget. When I read the text again, I remember the manner in which people said things. And I think it was good to have multiple recordings and writings happening at the same time, so you weren't too overwhelmed by one story. It always gave you some form of respite, you know?
Yeah. So, I mean, so with this whole thing of, so did you record all the interviews? Yeah. And did you also take notes? So I always find it a little, that whole piece, can sometimes be a little challenging. How do you record? Because sometimes, especially when you're having a sensitive conversation with somebody, how do you take out your recorder and how do you, kind of put it as an object there between this very intimate kind of a thing, and especially when people are talking about really painful things, right? So handling that, and or also, taking your own notes and then trying to keep pace with that while staying present in the conversation. And, so that whole thing can be quite challenging. It's amazing that you've done it. You've done it beautifully, but how did you do it?
You make it sound very complicated. And I never think about it when I'm in the, when I'm in it. But the first thing is the ethics of the interview. You must always let someone know that you will record them, obviously, because people have agreed to the conversation. They know why you're there. But keep in mind that someone may choose not to speak, even if they have agreed to speak. So silence is a choice, and that choice must be respected. However, should someone want to talk, it's always good to let them know you will record them. Personally, I'm not good with video at all. I'm quite technologically inadept with it, so I don't do it. Which is sad, because really when you do video, you can see the person and you can replicate that emotion in words. However, I'm just not good at it, so I don't go there. What I use is my phone, literally my normal phone. And the thing with the phone is now over time, it's become such a discrete object that people just think it's a phone. So I put, for anyone who is doing interviews out there, you can use a recorder, you can use the lapel mic if you'd like. For me, my interviews were not going to go anywhere apart from my own archive. So I wasn't too concerned with how high quality they were. In hindsight, that's probably a bad thing. I should have thought about it, but I didn't start with thinking about it. So now this is just what works for me. I record things on my phone, and I am very, very conscious about the notes that I take. The notes are really, they really help me steer my writing, because it's not just the things that are said in the oral history interview. It is as much the things that remain unsaid. The gesture, the movement, the body, the change of light, the change of voice, tone, tenor, where someone is silent, why someone is silent. I make a lot of drawings when I take notes as well. I will, if something like, say, a phrase or a sentence has stuck with me, I'll write that down. I write down, my notes are basically how someone exists in the room. It is less to do with what they are saying and they're more to do with their environment. But the thing I found very helpful is, because you're talking to older people and they have lots of tributaries in their conversations. conversation is never a single river. It is always little tributaries everywhere. And it's kind of rude to say, oh no, actually, let's return to the main thing, because the tributary can lead you into a really interesting piece of their life that you didn't think you were going to go to. But what I do, if I want to focus on a particular thing and say I have an interview that's 4 hours long, I will timestamp. I will write down the timestamp in my notebook so I know to go back and listen to this. Or I will write down a phrase that they have said, or I will make a drawing of how they are sitting, or I will record things like they looked out of the window at this minute, or there was a loud noise somewhere and it distracted them, or what we are eating, or what we are drinking, or how the dupatta falls. These are the things that I make note of. And I think that's primarily because my training, my only formal training, is as an artist. And the one thing we are taught in art school is how to observe the world, how to capture the world. I don't think a painting or a photograph is any different than a piece of writing. It must invite the viewer in. It must invite the reader, the viewer, your audience. And I think we need to treat it the same way. I'm very conscious about the landscape around me. I'm very conscious about the colors, the light, the seasons. I think about this a lot. I remember I'm a mentor for a writing program, and I was giving feedback to one of the writers yesterday, and I said, you have no colors in your book, you know? And it caught me off guard as well, because I don't consciously think about it, but we need our reader to imagine the world, because they are looking at a different world than we are looking at. You know, so I always think about the piece of writing in the same way as I do a painting or a photograph. You need to fill it in.
Yeah, that's lovely. You're right. I mean, I think that comes through in the writing, because you feel like you're sitting in that room where the conversation is happening, because you can feel and sense and see colors and feel the, whatever's there in the atmosphere. So yeah, and you've captured it beautifully. So
I think it was also because I wasn't making art anymore. It was a way for my earlier life as an artist to find place in my other life as a writer, I guess.
Okay. And that works. And I think that works very well for the reader, from the reader's point of view. It works beautifully. So I guess what is art's loss is the reader's gain. Okay. So, so that brings me to the other thing, which I was very curious about also is, of course, as one reads all the stories, of course, the subject matter is heavy, by its very nature. And like you have so beautifully captured all the details and the conversation and, the emotions as well. And just reading all of that, of course, what came to my mind as a psychologist is the whole thing about secondary traumatization, right? Because, and that happens in secondary trauma is really basically where you're exposed to a lot of traumatic information, which is not your own, but it is somebody else's experience. But if you're exposed to it for, for a very long period of time or repeatedly, right? Sometimes it can lead to this feeling of being traumatized yourself. So though it's not your own personal experience, but because you've very closely heard or, and repeatedly and over a period of time heard stories. So it happens with people who are in the helping professions, mental health professionals, or, in people who work with folks who have undergone trauma, especially with refugees, different kinds of situations, and also sometimes doctors and nurses or first responders. So anyway, so I was just wondering, I mean, this is a lot of material that you collected for this book, and a lot of it is quite raw. And I think for some of those people, because I suppose for many of those people, this was the first time, or they were talking about it, or they hadn't, talked about it for a very long. They hadn't processed their trauma, and that comes through in the interview, right? So I was just wondering about, how did you take care of this? And how did you deal with such painful information, some really painful information that you were exposed to?
I guess the easy answer is that I didn't. I didn't even realize that it was doing anything to me. And this is just a very honest reflection. I think when you're in the presence of a story that hasn't been uttered or verbalized in a long time or ever, it's a huge privilege to be on the receiving end of it. But you realize very quickly that even though you may have been instrumental in unearthing that story, it's not about you. It has nothing to do with you. You're just a catalyst. It could be anybody else. The story, the person, what they are feeling, how they are saying things, what they are touching, how they are gesturing, that is what is important. What happens once a story emerges? What happens to the person? Do they keep thinking about it? Do they forget about it? Is it an unburdening? Is it closure? To be honest, it almost is never closure. With partition, there may never be closure. But there is a sense of relief sometimes, of having verbalized something, of letting it out. I didn't realize what it was doing to me because I was so caught up in allowing people to say how much or how little they wanted to say. Because I was aware that no one had asked, no one would ask. And I think maybe only 5 years in, after Remnants had come out, did I realize that I had become a completely different person. I had difficulty speaking to people my own age. I was not interested in small talk. I find even now it's very overwhelming when I'm privy to many little small conversations at the same time. Like you go to a lit fest and you're talking to people and it's all like mindless conversation, like, what do you do? And I can't process that anymore. I find it's very overwhelming for me. And I need a lot of alone time or silence. The one thing I did when I realized how it had moved me, obviously there is a complete extreme end to this as well, which is compassion fatigue, which a lot of journalists who work on war territories or borderlands face, which is just not even being interested in the information because they have had such an overconsumption of it. I think after 10 years of recording stories of partition, I'm at that saturation level where I can't, I'm just too embedded in the subject to see with clarity what it means. And so I've taken a break from writing and thinking about it because I thought about it for 10 years every day. And it's very, very hard to take care of other people's sadness because even if a story is uplifting and positive, the seed of that story is very sad. So the one thing I did do is to go around and interview other oral historians that had worked on similar things, because that's what I was good at, to ask people how it felt, what it did to you. Do you have coping mechanisms? Did you stop? Did you take a pause? And I wrote a piece about that, interviewing different people who had worked on partition and other such traumas. But the very simple answer is that you just go on. You go on because people are dying. And this story will not be recorded if you or someone else who works like you doesn't do it, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So it's not a very positive answer.
No, I mean it's a real answer, right? And thank you for the honesty.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's hard, and it's not that. It's also not that one knows what's happening. I mean, in the sense that you don't know how something is going to impact you. You don't know how it's affecting you until it has affected you most of the times, right? And then you somewhere down the line you say, oh, okay, this is what. Most of the times we don't know.
Yeah, and I
that
think also
experience.
I mean, I was so young at the time, like 23 to 33, I've given my whole 20s to this work. It really like robs you of fundamental joys of being young. And only now do I really, I mean, I don't regret it. I would do it all over again because I understand what an archive it is for future generations. But you have to sacrifice a lot if you're going to do it seriously. And of course, you have to rise to the occasion. As a young person, I was probably never going to experience those things. I hope in my lifetime I don't see any such trauma, but you really need to know how to take care of other people's stories. You need to learn. I had to learn.
Yeah. And maybe because it is such a big project. I mean, and you've given years, like you said, you've given years of your life to this project. And perhaps that's why a lot of people don't go there, because it's not something that you can just, spend a few months and just get it done and move on. It's not going to be
No,
like.
and I think a lot of writers that do write on partition have it as a lifelong companion. I remember I had this conversation while writing that piece. I had a conversation with the two men who wrote an extraordinary book about women and partition called Borders and Boundaries with Kamaladevi. And I said, well, why don't you write about partition anymore? And she said, I don't have the vocabulary anymore. The vocabulary is exhausted. And I feel that as well. I hope I'll return to it at some point in my life, but I need some distance to find some clarity.
Yeah. And it'll happen when it happens. I mean, these things have their own, they don't have a timeline. It'll be, yeah. So I'm kind of jumping to my last question, because I'm just a little more aware of time, and I'm sure people have lots of questions. But my last question was to you. So what led you to? Is this part of what led you to move from? I mean, it's the same theme, but from nonfiction to fiction, or it was something else?
I think when you write real people's real stories, you're really aware that you can't change the story. You can't play with it. You're morally and ethically obligated to archive it the way that it was told to you, even if you may not agree with that perspective of history. I didn't know if I could ever write fiction because it was so removed from me and I had never tried. But the one thing that I didn't know about a subject matter like the back of my hand was partition. So it was very natural for me to gravitate to that subject, to place part of that fictional story in that setting of partition. That was obviously just, I didn't even think about it. It was inspired by the many, many stories that I had heard, and I created a framework, a patchwork of, outline drawn from many of these interviews and created a story. But I think the other thing that happens in fiction is that it allows you so much freedom in just the methodology of writing. It allows you a lot of freedom that I just had never experienced writing nonfiction, and I really enjoyed that. I was terrified by it because the power you have over the lives of these characters was unlike the power I had ever felt over the lives of the real people, because I was so careful doing justice to every sigh, every breath, every tear, that here was this uncharted territory for me. So I wanted to use the subject matter I knew the best to at least start that fictional story. So it takes part at the time of partition, but also goes back in time to World War I, which was another aspect of history that we know very little about in India and Pakistan.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, I think, it would have been quite incredible to write that story. I can imagine how, and perhaps that's part of the, I don't know, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's perhaps part of that whole thing of moving on, of having all this heaviness and then finding a way out, finding your own way out.
I think as well, like I have 3 books now, and they all touch in some way on the theme of partition. And I if I think about it, I am moving away from the nucleus of partition. The first book was with survivors, the second book with descendants, and the third book is fiction. So it moves very far away. Yeah, and I think that's a natural progression.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so I, of course, have many, many more questions that I can keep asking, Aanchal, but I'd really like you guys to have your time. Please, if anybody has any questions, we can do that now. But there are some comments here. I think Michelle writes, by the time I decided to look at my own family history, everyone has passed. It is great you started at 23. I'm trying on the wrong side of 50, but have decided I'm now the old person who needs to record what I know before I forget. So yeah, and
that's good. Your future generations will thank you for it.
Yeah, and then that's, I think, somebody else, Vaibhav, has also written, sadly, our pre-partition generation is disappearing rapidly. And except for few books with first-hand experience, we don't have a detailed view of pre-partition India. How did you conduct secondary research?
Oh, such a great question. All over the place, actually, in archives, in books, in any kind of pre-partition document I could find. And also one of the most fascinating, there were many instances in interviews where people mentioned, say, a riot or an attack that had not been recorded in history, communities that had undergone certain experiences that had not been put down, that had not been archived. And I think one of the most interesting ways was corroborating several interviews from the same cities or villages to be able to make sure that that event actually happened. I did a lot of work with Hindus and Sikhs in Mirpur, which is now in Pakistan. And some of the details that I heard was so horrific that I honestly couldn't believe that this had happened. But the more interviews I did with people from that area, the facts were near identical. So this is one way that you can corroborate stories. Another interesting source for secondary research is self-published memoirs. I know we all laugh about it when, family members publish their life stories and it's just for the family, but actually they have some incredibly valuable pieces of information, particularly if they have seen such momentous times, that are very helpful in, again, proving a certain event or a certain instance that someone else may be talking about in an interview. But at the end, I do have to say that there are certain events that you will not be able to validate. And one of the biggest questions I get as an oral historian is, how do you know, well, what is the veracity of the interview? What is the truth behind the interview? And when I was younger, I always wanted to really wanted to answer that question. And now I actually don't really care about that question, because we assume that when we refer to an archive which is in a library, then we are referring to truth. But that's another version of the truth. It's the version of the person who wrote that archive that we are referring to. So why is your grandmother or your aunt or your neighbor or someone else's mother not telling the truth, or their version of the truth? And I think for partition, we have to accept that there are multiple avenues of truth that will together help us to see a very cohesive outlook to that event, because everyone experienced it differently. Everyone had different memories of it. And I think one of the strengths of oral history is this diversity of perspective.
Yeah. And yeah. And I love the way you talk about truth, because there is, often there isn't that one objective truth. There is truth in most of, what people share, especially in terms of like you're talking about partition, and it's their experience, and that's the truth. That's the truth for them, and it's as true as anything that's put in a research document, because that's where it's come from. Okay, another question Nazneen has asked, is there a subject other than partition you wish to study and explore next?
Such a great question. So I was very, very intrigued by the two contingents of the Indian Army that went to fight in the First and Second World War. And I remain very interested in them because such little work has been done on the Army outside of military research. Because there is such a vast social and anthropological perspective to serving in the forces of the empire. So in my novel, I do write about the First World War, and I hope that that's a subject I'm going to work on more in the future. But I am very interested in the Second World War as well. Mostly I'm interested in world events that India was a large part of, and we were never taught about it in our history books as children, which is like the first and most formative way in which we understand our history.
Sudha has a different question. Sudha asks, which part was difficult to write, fiction or non-fiction, and which was therapeutic?
Fiction is very hard for me. Fiction is incredibly hard for me. I have enormous respect for novelists because like you're imagining so much of a world. And I think even when I'm writing fiction, I rely so much on my non-fiction training. Like if you go through my novel, every page has real information because I needed to rely on my own methodology to build my world. But fiction is incredibly hard to write, and kudos to all novelists out there. What is more therapeutic? It gives you a different kind of joy, I think, both genres. I think it's the intention for why you write something that determines how you feel when that is done. I know that the archive of partition that me and many other people have put together will benefit future generations. But I also know that there is such incredible joy in sinking into a novel and being detached from the world that we live in for a few days or a few weeks. So both are very interesting for me, but writing fiction is harder for sure. Yeah.
So Sonali writes, love your writing and listening to you, Aanchal. So her first question is, how many times did you have to edit your manuscript if you were keeping account? And
I was, but
okay.
probably many. Wait, fiction or non-fiction? Because I think I had to edit the fiction, like I think I probably read it like 40 times or something.
So that was the next part of her question. Saying, did it change for non-fiction and fiction? And how did you decide it was enough?
So I think with nonfiction, because I was relying so much on real interviews, there was very little editing that I allowed myself. I was not going to edit other people's thoughts. What would edit most is probably how much secondary information I put in there or the manner in which I wrote. So the editing there was minimal, or of course, if I went on and on and on and it went over the word limit. I don't remember there being such extensive edits in nonfiction, but in fiction, where I have to admit it was my first time writing fiction. So I was very much learning. I think I will still, if I write another novel, I'll still be learning. And in no way am I an expert in either genre. But with fiction, I was very lucky to get a great editor who had incredible foresight. She gave me notes that I thought were shocking. Like she told me to change an entire vast section of the novel in terms of what event happened when, and I was just like, what? And then I thought about it and I thought like, she has done this way more times than I have, so I will take her advice, and if it doesn't work, then I always have a draft to fall back on. And I'm glad I did, because she had incredible foresight. She knew what the novel would turn out to be. So the one thing I would say is either trust your editor or have a great reader that will give you honest advice and will not sugarcoat things for you, especially when it comes to fiction. Because I wrote so many drafts of that novel. I think if anyone reads it now, I'll give you an example. The sections that pertain to the First World War that happened on the battlefields, I think they are now maybe 4 chapters. And in the initial draft, I think it was something like 15 chapters. So it's really also about selecting what is absolutely imperative to include in the novel, and what you can do without, or what you can tuck into other bits, you know. But I think I was just very lucky to have a great editor.
Great. Okay, so the next question, of course, her second part of her question was, who are the authors or writing which inspires you?
I will read anything Anuradha Roy writes. I don't care what it is. I'll read anything and everything. I think, in my opinion, she's the finest, one of the finest novelists from India. Another person whose work has impacted me a lot is Svetlana Alexievich, who writes, of course, oral history and gives a lot of gravitas to the methodology of oral history. She's, I think, one of the first oral historians to have won the Nobel Prize as well. She wrote Chernobyl Prayer, Unwomanly Face of War, and it's really inspiring to see the depth of human emotion that she presents in her work. And then, of course, Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, Anis Kidwai wrote this great book. Begum Anis Kidwai wrote this great book in Urdu called Azadi Ki Chhaaw Mein, which was translated as In Freedom's Shade, about the camps after partition and how she worked with other women and men to take care of refugees, which is a book I return to a lot.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And Nishant has asked, you must have interviewed and have met so many people who have seen the partition and have experienced it firsthand. According to you, have they made peace with the facts and reality, and how, considering the way it has affected both the countries?
Well, I'm wary to generalize because it's so different for every single person. But if I had to, I would say that they have no choice but to be at peace with it. Some of them have been lucky enough to actually go back. I don't know whether that's better or worse sometimes, whether it's more cruel to see what has happened or what doesn't remain than to have pristine memory of how you left things. But I would say it's different for different people. And of course, it's different for different countries also, how we see the event. The one thing I have realized is that we perceive partition from an incredibly Indo-centric lens. And we must be open to the understanding that partition means different things to different people and to different nations. For Pakistan, it's the gaining of nation state. So I'm very careful sometimes when Indians look at partition with such incredible loss. And for someone who straddles the border and speaks to both sides, I'm very careful as to how I take care of that loss, because you must always acknowledge that Pakistan gained nationhood, and we must respect that as well. For India, of course, we see it as loss. And for Bangladesh, 71 is a far more important date than 47. So with an event that is perceived differently by the three nations it impacted, I don't know what closure means. I don't know what reconciliation means. I don't know what peace means. And I don't know if we will see these things in our lifetime. We can only prepare for them. We can only show as many perspectives from either side of the border as we are able to, so that people can see the other as human as well, or having shared that same loss or confusion or longing for a historical past. Yeah, sorry, I don't know if that answers your question completely. I don't know if there's actually one answer to your question.
Yeah. Vaibhav writes, great point about looking at partition from both perspectives, staying impartial, being an observer as an author.
It doesn't come very easily. It's like I'll give you a great example. Like researchers are not immune to bias. I was conducting an interview with a Pakistani gentleman, and I remember his family were Hindu and they remained in Pakistan. And through our interview, he was saying the word, he was identifying as a Pakistani Hindu. And I was saying the words Hindu Pakistani. And those words actually mean different things. His main identifier was his nationality, whereas I was putting an identifier as religion as the first thing. And it took me a while to realize that I was doing it. And I don't really understand why I did it, but I remember writing also that I felt almost ashamed because I'd done it for nearly an hour. Again and again, I heard myself saying it, and I corrected myself. So we are not immune to this, and we catch ourselves. The point is that every day is a process of unlearning, because there will always be something you are unlearning or learning.
Yeah. And I guess at the end of the day, we're all human. And the great thing is we can learn, but of course the learning process never ends.
Very humbling.
Yeah. Yeah. But awesome. It's just been completely awesome for me, definitely. And I'm sure for all of us here today to hear you speak and to talk to us about the book and the process and all of that. I think we've kind of come, unfortunately, to the end of our time. So thank you so much, Aanchal, for being here with us today, for giving us your time and answering our questions so honestly, openly, and graciously. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope it was helpful for other people that are doing similar methodological work and for others as well. And I really appreciate your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.